Our speakers today lead national and global efforts to redefine what matters in education, how to deliver and measure at scale, really a key question this initiative is asking. We're joined today by Dr. Vicki Phillips, the CEO of the National Center on Education and the Economy, and Dr. Timothy Knowles, the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. I want to give them a chance to say a few words, and then we'll jump right in.
Go ahead.
So it's almost Dickensian following Singapore in the sense that there's such elegance there, and then thinking about how do you extract from that into our messy system, which is rooted around a fundamentally different idea of democratic localism. There's an extraordinary local control in the United States that means lots of different things happen, whether it's from a curricular perspective, a teaching perspective, a values perspective. That said, I want to just start with a sort of observation about the diploma, and inherent in our American diploma are a set of limitations that we have to be clear-eyed about. One, and I'll just put three on the table very quickly. One is rooted around the education sector's addiction to inputs. It's not really an outcomes-based, competency-based representation of what young people know and can do. It's really premised on something my foundation brought the world literally in 1906. I can't help it. You're laughing, but I can't help it. The Carnegie Unit, or the credit hour, which is the conflation of time and learning. Right. And
You're doing penance, I assume.
I'm doing my penance now. It's a woefully inadequate proxy for learning based on everything we know about what knowledge is and how it's acquired. But that's what the diploma is premised on. Second problem with the diploma is that it ignores these things, whether you call them soft skills or 21st century skills. We changed that when the 21st century came. And then for a minute they were called non-cognitive skills. I don't know if you remember that, but I thought that was very funny because an itch is cognitive. So now they're durable or transferable, what have you. They remain very consistent, and yet they don't show up in our diploma. We've said academic skills or bust, but these other things, these really important things about communication, collaboration, ethics, critical thinking, creativity, curiosity, which we know predict success, don't show up. And so there will be an uphill battle until we make the diploma reflective of both academic and durable skills, if you want to use that language. And the final point I'll make is that the transcript, which is really representative of what the diploma is if I had slides, I would literally, I have a transcript made in 1886 and one made in 2024, and they are identical, except one is in longhand, literally identical. And so what we signal with our transcript and our diploma to the post-secondary sector and to the workforce is frankly that this hasn't changed in 150 years. And whatever we're doing is the same as what we were doing before electricity and cars and airplanes and computers and all the rest of it. And in some ways that is true.
Dr. Phillips?
So I'll just preface my remarks and then add to what Tim said about the diploma by just letting you know that one of the things that NCEE does is, in addition to the fact that we work at the intersection of education and economy, we actually study high-performing, rapidly rising, and exceptional innovators around the world. And for the last 3 years have been running and co-convening a project with OECD to help 7 high-performing and rapidly accelerating places think about their next trajectory, including Singapore. So it's such a pleasure to be able to reinforce a lot of what my esteemed colleagues said here is happening in Singapore, but actually happening in a number of other places as well. But in the US, as we think about the diploma, I think Tim is absolutely right. Its value has shifted so dramatically, and I think we have to think about how do we evaluate diplomas or end of high school or whatever we want to call it by its trajectory power. How does, how successful are young people in post-secondary or in gainful employment that represents an evolving economy, or in civic participation, and the other kinds of things that were part of the last conversation. But we need to think about what's it trajecting people into, rather than what kind of seat time is it currently providing.
So, and I don't think we all necessarily know what a diploma means either. It theoretically means ready for higher education, but kids get a diploma, still need remediation. I don't think any of us think it means ready for workforce today. Right. But a lot of our discussion is around Diploma Plus. So can you address kind of what should be the diploma and what should be kind of a certification or credentialing that signifies something perhaps more specific or more tangible around a career pathway than presumably there, or is there even a role for generic diploma? Should it only be credentialing? I mean, kind of what should the ultimate product mean for the learner and for employers, potential employers?
Creating something that's competency or mastery based, that is legible, which includes core academic skills as well as soft or non-academic skills, but measuring those reliably and credibly, not just sort of putting your best guess out there, which is another big question about how you measure complicated things like persistence. But that could also include a credential of some sort, a credential that would maybe be interesting to boys, to go and get something that would be of immediate value upon completion of high school. And we have to remember only, 30% or so of Americans finish post-secondary school. So there's a huge number of young people who need something of value by the time they finish high school. That's the picture, but I think the important argument for that picture is that we currently under-leverage the talent that we have in extraordinary ways. So if you take a young woman who is growing up in rural Colorado and goes working on her parents' family farm, in a dairy farm, she wakes up and works for 2 hours on the farm before she gets to high school. She gets to high school, she's there 97% of the time, she does all her homework, she gets B's or better, and she has a job after school or on the weekends. Tell me on aggregate, those signs aren't powerful signals of persistence or work ethic that aren't made legible to the post-secondary sector or the workforce, but they could be. And that young woman is got some extraordinary capacity that we are under-leveraging under. So our obligation as, I think, educators and policymakers is to figure out how we can get at that level of precision about young people and make it visible.
Yeah, we continue to be very bound by strictures and structures in the U.S. when, if you look at what many of these other countries are doing, they are setting credentials with employers, educators, and government working together to do that. They are varying times so that some credentials you can earn in 3 years, some you can earn in 4, some you can earn in 5. You can have on-ramps and off-ramps into post-secondary. If you want to go to college, you can change at any point in time. You have choice, so you're not bound. There's no dead ends, and you're given the supports to do that. And all of them hold high value as being, aligned to an evolving economy, aligned to the kind of democratic and civic participation that these countries want. So they are just very much, yes, doing credentials of all kinds, a post-secondary credential, a workforce credential of different clusters of work, but not bound by the kind of how long do you have to be in school. You can't earn money while you're in school, which has long been, a norm here. And the level of apprenticeship, some of which you're doing in Colorado, is providing part of those on and off ramps.
Good. I also, by the way, want to welcome to our discussion a member of my cabinet, our director of the Labor and Employment Agency, Joe Barella. Welcome. We're glad to have you here as well from Colorado. So along the lines of what you talked about, you said there's something to note about perseverance in the example you gave. Have you seen any promising practices around who has been successful in measuring or credentialing those in a meaningful way that we can learn from?
Yeah, in all candor, this is a very squishy field. I mean, Carnegie is partnered now with ETS, which is the largest assessment company on earth, and that was very intentional on our part to see if we can build reliable and credible tools. And we're piloting tools to measure these things in Nevada and Indiana, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, and North Carolina now, to try to build tools that will capture evidence of some of these critical skills that really otherwise we're relying, sometimes appropriately, but we're relying on teacher judgment. The other thing we're trying to do with these tools is so they're not multiple choice tests, despite it coming from ETS. That was a joke. They're interactive, they're gamified, they're problem-based, scenario-based. They're actually interesting for young people, and they're designed to detect learning, whether it happens in or out of school. If we're really going to crack the Carnegie unit and the deconflate time and learning, we have to convince families that what their young people are learning, whether it's in an internship or an apprenticeship or elsewhere, actually has currency. So in order to create currency, you need to build reliable assessments that then are used by employers and the post-secondary sector. So we have a big project called Skills for the Future that we're beginning to do that, but frankly, it's early in that adventure.
But as we think about the whole trajectory, which is high quality early learning, fostering excellence all the way through to graduation, creating different kinds of pathways, we also have to acknowledge that we're looking more holistically at the outcomes for young people, and not everything is going to be measured, right? So if you think about what our colleagues said earlier, we're thinking about the kinds of core skills that kids need and the basic subject areas. You're thinking about the habits of learning and well-being that young people need. You're thinking about the contemporary skills, including the skills that make you uniquely human right now, which employers are saying is second only to analytical skills is creativity right now, because that helps you deal well with AI and other things. And then you're thinking about community skills. What makes you a well-rounded, human being able to engage in civic participation? And some of those things are not going to be able to be measured, so we have to be really careful about how we have this conversation, and the things that we decide are the key indicators to measure, while at the same time we're looking for this more holistic education for our young people, because that's what will put them on the trajectory to long life learning. The other thing these countries are doing is they're now thinking about prenatal through 100, because they're acknowledging that we're all living longer, and the young people right now are going to be living longer, and they are going to need to upskill, reskill over the course of time. So you can't just think about the end of post or the end of secondary as we currently know it as the end point. It's by no means the end point, and we need to be thinking all the way along that trajectory and aligning our institutions and perhaps creating new kinds of entities that can be helpful.
One of the interesting things that makes me hopeful about this moment that we're in is embedded and reflected in the portraits of a graduate that are now 27 states have them, literally thousands of schools and hundreds of school systems have built these visions of what, with lots of stakeholders engagement, of what they want for school. And we did an analysis of them and basically found that they're very similar. And that urban, rural, red, blue, suburban, there's like an invisible American consensus about the core purposes of schooling, which are rooted around these kinds of skills and values. And that's encouraging, I think. There's something to build on in that. There's miles to go, but I think there's much more consensus and understanding about what both the economy and democracy demand here, and what our schools should be about.
So, Tim, you're, of course, doing your penance and leading the effort to rethink the Carnegie Unit. Vicky, NCEE has long sought to lead in informing innovation, changing traditional education models. My question is, how does this fit on this, or not fit, with kind of this structure we have? What structural changes are needed to align time and teaching and outcomes? I mean, is this the sort of thing where a new practice would simply be piloted in some district somewhere or some charter school somewhere? Because remember, it's also driven from kind of the top down on the elite side. For the university side, they expect to see the transcript, they accepted the grades. The parents will rebel if a school is doing something that doesn't let their kids get into college. Can we even do this with our small d democratic structure and untold school districts? I have 178 in my state. You know, and I was hearing from, of course, Dr. Un Seng Tan, who said they have one teacher preparation academy in Singapore. That boggles our minds, right? Because we don't even have a definitive number. We have reciprocity here. We have a route from the military here. We have 12 universities here. We have a different way you can do it with this program and that. I mean, there must be practically a different way for almost every teacher. I mean, obviously we do have some teaching schools and they do produce, they're the workhorses of it, but it's just not, you know, it's not one system. So systemically, can what you're talking about even be mapped onto our system, or are we talking about structural change and something different here?
Well, you're working on a big structural change. So you might comment on it and then I can comment more broadly.
I mean, I think actually, Governor, you said last night, really this has to be all rooted around outcomes. And so we have to get that part right. And if we don't, we're going to muddle around for another decade or more. And I'll just give one example from our work in post-secondary that we rolled out a month ago. We classify every university and college in the country. So you've heard of R1 or Research 1 institutions. That comes from Carnegie. We decided we were going to reimagine the classifications. And so we did. And one of the ways we reimagined them was to say, let's classify higher education based on their contributions to social and economic mobility. And let's look at outcomes. And so every college and university that gets federal funding, which is obviously diminishing, in the nation, is now got a classification that focuses on the extent to which they're providing access to the students in the communities, regions, states, nation that they serve representatively, so Pell kids, kids of color, and what their earnings are over an 8-year arc. So an access and earnings classification. I was told not to do this in this climate because we'd be giving the wrong people a tool to bludgeon higher ed even further. But what we did en route was we identified 479 what we call opportunity colleges and universities, or of 4,000, that are doing remarkable things, that are high access and high earnings. Some of them are usual suspects, but some of them, like Blackfoot Community College in Montana or Ball State in Indiana, that trains lots of teachers, are unusual. And I give that example as an example of an outcomes orientation to the post-secondary sector that has generated literally hundreds of stories in local communities about the fact that our institutions are actually delivering results for young people. And next step is to drive public policy that way. So states should incent institutions to become opportunity colleges and universities. I think that's an answer to your question. I'm saying let's anchor around the outcomes that we really care about and then drive the policy incentives largely at the state level and the incentives for programmatic interventions to the places that are doing the things that we know are delivering results.
Yeah, I think there's multiple times in our history where a state has literally changed its trajectory, given good leadership, and I think that's possible still. When you look at what most of these high-performing countries are doing, they're doing 4 big things that threaded through the conversation earlier, and I think all those are possible, particularly within a state. We might not be able to get that full on, but usually when multiple states then go down a pathway, it catches fire. But I think there's considerable amount of shift that could happen in states, and I think we may need to think differently about innovation zones and some other things that allow us to really explore what the possibilities are and open up some of that aperture and imagination. But yeah, it's one thing I feel very optimistic about because I actually do see some states that are on this path.
Let's open it up. Yes, Jen.
Dr. Knowles, I have a question about your institution classification. Is that for everyone who enrolls or just those that complete?
It's for everyone who enrolls, very intentionally. So completers and non-completers are part of the equation.
That's great. I mean, that's one of the things I think we struggle with, at least in Colorado. Only 50% of our high school graduates are going to post-secondary, and then we have a large number who start and never complete. So I'm glad to see that it looks at the full gamut of everyone who enrolls.
And remarkably, we got from the federal data, IRS data, as well as hyper-regionalized census data. So we can do very careful comparisons, so we don't compare a kid growing up in the Delta in Mississippi to, I don't know, LA. So we've been very careful about ensuring that it's a fair representation of earnings and access.
Yes.
One thing I'm excited about, along with kind of the new measures that Skills for the Future is developing, is through our initiative, Student Upward Mobility Initiative, we have a lot of researchers in the field right now trying to also see if we can measure some of these things using existing assessments, using the formative and summative assessments. Can we measure critical thinking and things like that, so that there are ways to scale this pretty quickly. But in that measure of scaling, Tim, I'm interested in like examples where you've seen the barrier of like a new credential or a new signaling work. Like when do employers or when do universities want that, and why, so that we can learn from, if we do need to build new signals, and then maybe we have collectively, we are building those tools, why do people want to look for them? They say they want them, but they also want to use the old signals.
That's a good question. I think what we've tried to do with the identification of the skills that matter is tether it really tightly to which ones actually move the needle in terms of things we care about. So lifespan, health outcomes, earnings, not going to prison, et cetera. The things that and there's good empirical evidence under some of the skills that, so that's where we start, is to say, are these predictive of the right things? We're listening to employers really carefully about what they say they need. Also important, because if there's dissonance there, and there often is between certainly K-12 and employers, even in terms of how they define those skills. Then what we're trying to do is, this may be too far into the weeds, but we're like, I think I said earlier, the skills haven't been really well defined at all. And so we're trying to define what they are, what the sub-skills are, and what the progressions of those skills are. In essence, create a skill genome that anybody, then that open source it, that anybody can use to say, oh, here's some really good people who've aligned scholarship and employers who are thinking about adaptability or creativity or critical thinking, and then try to create a common ground, a common language for us. As we know skills are important, but we need actual common definitions if we're going to see them and be embedded credibly into curriculum, into assessments, into credentialing.
And picking the critical few that are truly trajectory altering, not, I mean, we can all have conversations where we just add on, and everybody wants their indicator. And I think we have to really resist that and be very clear about what we're after.
Okay. Comments? Yes, please, Maria.
So North Dakota has I'll kind of give some context. 2 bills were passed in 2021. The Learn Everywhere bill, so essentially allowing for external work-based learning, external opportunities to count towards high school credit hours, and then the learning continuum. So essentially allowing for more of a mastery or competency-based model that would count and be as equal to a traditional diploma. Both of those efforts, I would say, unfortunately, to previous Governor Burgum and I would say now Governor Armstrong have not taken the ramp that we were hoping. We have very few that are actually using it. What I've noticed also from coming from a school district and now being in state policy is the reverting back to a more traditional mindset. So they started going down mastery frameworks, they started going down competency or proficiency based, and then with community pushback, I don't understand what a proficiency scale is, or kids aren't, understanding the importance of turning in homework or kind of more of those traditional pieces. Communities have now jumped back to a more traditional measurement system. What recommendations do you have for a state to try to scale some of those pieces? Like, we have the law and the framework, but I'm trying to figure out how do you build the community will, I guess, to change practice.
Yeah, it's there's no easy answer to that question, right? But the handful of states right now that we're working on to change larger policy sets in this regard, we're working kind of in a holistic vertical way as well as a horizontal way. So we are not just working to help shift policy, but we're actually working with every superintendent in the state, all the school leaders in the state. We're getting a number of districts to get ahead of the policy shift and start to show what's possible. So there's no magic, I can't give you a magic bullet, but one thing from my own experience, I've been a state chief, I've been a soup, a number of other things in my career, but one thing I've experienced over and over again is we change policy at the state level without bringing people along, and then it falls on less than fertile ground, and it feels like compliance, and the country's littered with those efforts. But what I see some states doing right now that's really powerful is they are bringing young people to the table. They're bringing teachers and leaders to the table. They're bringing business and higher ed to the table. They're building that larger coalition, but they're not just building it to say, oh, you guys go out there and be champions. It's let's talk about how real change happens, and let's do it in larger scales than just 1 or 2 proof points, which is why I think thinking differently, bigger about how we create more room for innovation, how we allow some things to flourish, if you will.
I definitely agree, like exemplars is key, evidence is key, employers are key. They need to remind educators what matters. And I would say sort of on a more meta level, the country has been through a moment like this before. When we moved from agrarian to industrial economy, literally a third of the workforce left farming in a lifetime in this country. And in that time, in that very same time, a uniquely American idea was born, and that was universal high school education, which arguably drove our economy, our democracy, social fabric for the last 100 years. We're at a similar juncture, I think, where we project that a lot of people are going to move out of work and jobs that we currently know, and that there are these signals in America that it's not universal high school education this time, it's universal high school transformation this time. It's going to take a while. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's very palpable. I think the signals, the demand is there from communities, and so I think there's an opportunity for states, to your point in particular, to do something, some states to do some things that are truly extraordinary and can get us to the universal high school transformation reality more quickly.
And I think big allies in this are the young people themselves, particularly young leaders. We are in such a moment of underestimating this current generation. We're getting painted a picture about how anxious they are, how all these problems exist. And none of those, I mean, those things are not 100% untrue, but there are ways to mitigate them. You've heard Singapore talk about that. And what we're not doing is helping them be solution seekers. They came out of COVID with a very clear view of how they wanted education to change, and we have yet to listen to that or to engage them, particularly the young leaders across the country. And I think building coalitions of young leaders is also helpful to this cause.
Yes, Michael.
Well, I'll take a shot at another long trend historical perspective, because I go back. I was before Nation at Risk came out. I was actually a member of a local school board in New England. I was the only 7th grader to be able. No, I'm not 7th grade. And then later, at the height of the effort to respond to Nation at Risk, I was a state senator and vice chair of the education committee, in Connecticut. And then was not so connected to ESSA, but was around deeply for Common Core development and implementation from the higher education perspective now, right? And have been very connected to the K-12 world from a policy and somewhat of a practice with the teacher preparation issues in one state, right? My theory is that with all the difficulty, stumbling, and all the rest, is that we're actually probably, I do have a feeling like we're better in the K-12 world than we were 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. Huge gaps in certain parts of the country, certain parts of certain states or whatever, but I think we're better. We're clearly in an area where in K-12 there's a lot of ferment and pressure around improvement. Whether the responses work or not is always another issue, but there's a lot of public attention, a lot of ferment comes and goes, but there's a lot going on. Mm-hmm. So I get involved in higher education 17 years ago, and I was saying for a while to people that, your turn, our turn is coming. We're going to start to really pay a lot more attention on the performance of higher education, the fact that we're rolling out a system that undergraduate education that basically Harvard finished the design of 100 years ago, and it really is not working anymore at scale, right? And institutions that used to be selective admissions are now literally most universities in the country, public and private, are de facto open enrollment, right? Most people don't know that, but that's the case. I'm no longer so sure that higher ed moment is coming, other than in a sort of a shrinking in funding, both for punitive reasons and also because of economic and state budget reasons, and that I'm just really not sure that there's I think the new Carnegie classifications are really fascinating, but I'm just not sure politically, that there is the will with higher education to go beyond the cheerleading mindset of the elites about my alma mater, particularly the one with the football team and the basketball team, to one where we really sort of subject post-secondary education to the same scrutiny that we've now given higher ed, K-12 for 40 years. So curious as to what your...
I don't know if it's
Should I be more optimistic?
I don't know if it's exactly working K-12 necessarily, but you're saying it's worked better in K-12 than higher ed?
I think the line of progress has sort of emerged. Now, I'm not talking about the tremendous work. Graduate education is a whole other world, right? And the tremendous advances are another world. And elite institutions are another world. But I'm just talking about like the run of the regional universities, even the community colleges, particularly like if you're in an AA general studies program. I'm just not sure that the external pressures are there for continued improvement, let alone disruptive.
Or let's say the ones that show up in the wrong quadrant of your chart, the ones that are high cost and low value or negative value. I think you found some that are negative value.
We did, yeah. That are really low access, and also low outcomes, and that I actually think that higher ed, set aside the Trump administration, was facing an existential crisis already. And set aside him putting celebrity institutions in his sights. The demographic cliffs in terms of enrollment, confidence, public confidence in higher ed, the affordability issues, the access issues, $1.7 trillion worth of debt. It's school closures, the acceleration of school closures and consolidations. I actually think that and then welcome AI which will bring the cost of education down to close to zero over time, and not in the form of a four-year college degree, but the actual opportunity to learn is going to be highly accessible. I think higher ed, this is a moment that higher ed has to make its case, and it has to make its case based on outcomes. Otherwise, the landscape is going to change radically over the next 10 years, which could be good. There could be good in that. We're going to have new models, but there's also, I think its time is here in that sense.
And/or nothing will change if we continue to treat all this as siloed things. K-12 siloed from higher ed, siloed from economic development, siloed from. And the conversations going on in states that I think hold the greatest promise right now are really linking those things. Educational excellence and workforce excellence, and understanding that those things have something to do with each other. And governors particularly understand that those things have something to do with each other.
I think it's fine to, obviously our focus is more K-12, but it's actually linked with higher ed. I think one of the problems is the federal role, because the funding is all input-based, Pell Grant student loans. Not only is there zero incentive to deliver more content knowledge in a shorter period of time, you actually would get penalized financially as an institution for doing that, or perhaps even rendered ineligible. So have you been thinking about, it's a little bit beyond our purview as governors, but have you been thinking about this federal role, since that's the big money piece in education, and how we can change the affordability programs, Pell, student loans, their successors, to drive innovation rather than prevent innovation?
Yes, Carnegie brought Pell to the world, so that's one of
Another area of penance.
It's another, yeah. And so I think you actually sort of answered your own question with can you leverage the tranches of federal capital in a way that would drive innovation. The current debates about Pell aren't helpful because they're not leading us that way. But I do think the tides will turn. And I think that when they do, there's both opportunity to provide greater incentive to institutions that are actually getting results, leveraging Pell and other federal tranches, and there's ways we should think about Pell that are very different. Like, could you, and this is probably anathema, but might you consider paying people who demonstrate they know things, leveraging the Pell Grants, rather than having them go to college? They could learn anywhere from any source, but create the right rigorous assessment regime, and then for value-add job for nursing or for something industrial engineering, something valuable, you could get, and you pass the courses, you get $2,000. Like, that would be a creative way to think about how you build a social capital, human capital.
Just one quick, you're almost like the idea of taking, if you could take Pell and WIOA, and a state could get a waiver based on a plan to do with at least some of that, something very different, and as opposed to, so in the COVID relief money, to higher ed, everything has got pumped through the Title IV formula. Right. On the K-12 side, my understanding, wasn't really too much involved in that, is a lot of that money was at least discretionary to the SEA, State Education Agency, and could try to do some change agenda with it other than Title I money. And on higher ed, it's just, like you said, it's just freight train to the status quo.
Yeah. Any other questions? So let's talk about assessment. A lot of what you're talking about, in terms of measuring outcomes requires more assessment. There's more assessment. How do you strike that balance between kind of not having over-assessment, which we also hear about, and democratically elected school boards hear about, there's too much assessment, there's too much assessment, not enough instruction. So if we're going in the direction of more assessment because we want to make sure the students are learning in different areas, any advice on kind of how we can show that benefit to the families and the students?
I'm really bullish on what might be called testless assessment.
Okay.
Which would leverage Gen AI.
I think the students would like that too.
Students,
Sounds good, right?
students produce enormous amounts of of artifacts in their daily lives. And
So using the
we
standardized.
should leverage problem sets, videos of group work, written work, conversations with teachers, conversations with bots that can be metacognitive. We can leverage all that, and with approvals from the right people, families and students themselves, to provide insights that will be in many ways, I think, more useful than the insights we get from the multiple choice, single point in time, standardized tests that we've got in our heads. So I think the future there is actually really bright, because it doesn't mean you have to argue, oh, no, we really need to do this raft of skills-based assessments now on top of English and math and history or whatever. So I think it's going to be a brave new world. I'd be curious.
Of course, being able to tape record the classroom, that'll be difficult too politically, but we'll see. One challenge at a time.
Yeah.
But you could put the student and the family in the position of having total control
Sure.
over the submission of evidence. Right?
We would be in this bucket too of probably less assessment, just stronger indicators and more creative ways. Because we look around the world to see what's happening out there, particularly among high performers like Singapore and others, we are actually engaged in a benchmarking exercise right now around looking around the world at next generation assessments and next generation accountability. Just to be able to say, not to recommend, but just to say, here's what really great practice is, including here's who's using AI and other technologies and in what ways they're doing that, to try to shed some insight on this.
Do you, when you look at going back to kind of the K-12 side, the skills that students need to succeed, we obviously also look to the private sector. How would you view kind of the ideal way that on the school side we would partner with employers, the private sector, who would presumably, be in a more dynamic place to know exactly what's needed than, others who might just be involved with education their whole lives? Clearly, there needs to be a feedback loop here with the private sector that is currently very haphazard at best.
You said it last night, that the private sector is very busy.
They are, yeah.
And so their ability to engage deeply with K-12 or post-secondary on these questions is haphazard. And so I think we do need to think kind of if really part of the purpose of the educational infrastructure is to prepare people for purposeful lives and work, then we need to think about how you architect that in a less haphazard way. And I don't have direct answers, but I do think having, without the employers, we're gonna be very hard. We're gonna get it wrong.
Yeah, I would agree. And they are busy in some ways they felt burned, right, over the last decade or two, but very willing now to come back to the table. Again, in some of the states we're working in, the business leaders are actually chairing the coalitions and deeply engaged and helping lay out policies that demand new kinds of metrics.
I think one other thing that I know College Board does this. It thinks about how to engage the private sector in the development of the curricula and the AP courses that you build, and you're doing it increasingly. The problem with the standards movement, which we've all lived in for 40 years, or I have.
Has it been 40 already?
At least. We assumed that we would build standards on the front end and then build tests on the back end, and everything in the middle would magically take care of itself, particularly the learning experiences, the curriculum. And it didn't. To oversimplify, the big publishers rebranded the curriculum as Common Core aligned, and not enough in the middle of what a student actually experiences changed and what a teacher's daily charge was. So I think I'm just underscoring that this issue that you're putting on the table, if we're really thinking that part of what high school particularly is about is building a sense of purpose and direction and agency towards career, whether that career requires post-secondary or not, then we don't just need business involved in the kind of identifying the skills, we also need their help in in building the learning experiences and the content.
And we have to think about those career-connected experiences all the way up through K to 12. Can't just start once they hit high school.
Well, let us thank Dr. Phillips, Dr. Knowles. Thank you for joining our NGA initiative.